In this video I will comment the paragraphs 4, 5 and 6 of the introduction of the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences. I do not comment word by word, I just express the broad idea. I will maybe put a link to the link of the text in English on marxist.org, so that if you are interested in reading the translation and if you have the opportunity, buy the book, preferably in German if you somehow speak German. But I just comment the broad ideas to make the paragraphs intelligible. So, fourth paragraph. It has been said that religion and philosophy have the same content, but philosophy has to distinguish itself from religion by its own proper, specific, distinct mode of knowledge, because the object of religion is truth, absolute truth, and so is the object of philosophy. And philosophy has to demonstrate, to prove its ability to know the object of religion, which is truth, by itself, by its own mode of knowledge. And there is a misunderstanding regarding religion and philosophy, because there have been many religious conflicts throughout the ages between the various religions or the various branches of the same religion. And people in our day and age, when they are interested in philosophy, they think that philosophy is rational thinking, whereas religion is irrational. And but the conflicts in the realm of philosophy are as pronounced, and maybe even more, than in the realm of religion. The history of philosophy is a constant and very long struggle, but Hegel says in the preface of the Phenomenology that this conflictual development has to be grasped in its unity, in the self-unfolding process of truth. It is the whole process which is truth itself. And there are those who reject religion and choose philosophy as some sort of spirituality. But can there be a spirituality without religion, or a religion without spirituality? The answer is no. And there are those who reject both religion and philosophy, namely the modern atheistic, rationalistic, mostly Anglo-Saxon, who think that religion is just nonsense and that philosophy is just babbling and armchair theorizing. But yeah, that's the view of Anglo-Saxon rationalistic scientists. But actually philosophy and religion have the same content, but philosophy has to develop its own mode of expressing this content. Then, paragraph number 5. The content of truth, which is religious truth, has to be, he doesn't use the word aufgehoben, but I will use aufgehoben, namely negated in the form of form, especially precisely. I mean, the form of religious truth has to be negated, but the content has to be preserved. So, religion, philosophy is the Aufhebung of religion, because it preserves the content, but expresses this content in thoughts and concepts. And it is only through philosophy that religion can be enlightened and properly understood. So philosophy is the enlightenment of itself and of religion and of art and of all other forms of knowledge. And then there's an old bias, an old prejudice an old bias, namely that, which is a metaphysical bias. The old metaphysicians believed that it is only through a thinking activity that one can access the truth of objects. So metaphysics begins with immediacy, thinks about the object it is trying to know, and only the result of this thinking process gives us access to the truth. So the paragraph says, feelings, intuitions, opinions, representations have to be transformed into thoughts. And I will illustrate. The modern atheistic, rationalistic thinkers, they don't believe in metaphysics, but they are not aware that human beings are metaphysical creatures, that a human being who says I is already a metaphysician. So the modern physicist, when they want to know what is this book from a physical standpoint, that's the illustration that I took in my previous video, they will transform this given object, this immediately given object, and they will make very complex theory to explain that it is a set of atoms, structures in molecules who are held together by the electromagnetic force, that there are negative and positive charges, that it has a mass which attracts the book towards the center of the earth. If I drop the book, it falls towards the earth. That's the curvature of time-space, its gravity, the electromagnetic force make the book seem one and seem impenetrable. And if I try to put my finger on the book, a clever physicist will say you have the impression, you have the illusion that your finger is touching the book, but actually there's electromagnetic repulsion between the atoms of your finger, the negative charges of the atoms, the electrons of the atoms of your finger, which make you believe that you touch the book, but actually you don't, because the negative electric forces of the electrons, there's a repulsive force, so that I do not literally touch the book. And the physicists will say that you have the illusion that this book is one with one finite and determined limit, but actually on a quantum level it is one with the entire quantum field. So the modern atheistic physicists, they are metaphysicians. They tell me, or they tell anyone, that this book is not what it seems. It's just a quantitative determination of the universal quantum field. That's probably why quantum physics is the physics of quanta. Yeah. And so philosophy, in this sense, is not different from atheistic, rationalistic thinking, because philosophy transforms immediacy into thought, into the form of thought. Plato would say, if you want to know what this book is, I'm not talking about the philosophical content, but Plato would say that if you want to know what this is, you have to grasp by a cognitive process the idea of a book, which in the language of Hegel is the universal. And the universal is the idea of a book. The particular is the German translation, the German version of the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, and the singular is this one book, and there are many other books because it has been mass produced. So this is the singular piece. The particular is the title, and the universal is the idea of the book. So Plato said only the universal, the idea, is true. So the Anglo-Saxons, not only Anglo-Saxon, because science, as we understand it, is universal, but I think mostly about the Anglo-Saxons, they don't believe in metaphysics, but they behave like Plato. So they are unconscious metaphysicians. Okay. And then, still in the 5th paragraph. So basically, it's impossible to refute metaphysics, because if you refute something, it presupposes that you are a subject trying to refute an argument, an opinion, whatever. And the very fact of being a subject, namely to be able to say I and to speak and to have self-consciousness, is already metaphysical. So, yeah. So, philosophy is knowledge and truth in the form of thought, and it is kind of discredited, disregarded, even despised by a presumptuous idea that those who disregard philosophy are capable of understanding philosophy and to be able to judge philosophy. But Hegel says it is only after having studied thoroughly the other sciences that one is capable of having a knowledge and to be able to express a view, an opinion on these sciences. If you want to criticize the modern theories of theoretical physicists, you have to have at least studied physics for a long time. You can't just say, that's nonsense. You have to study physics first, and then you can make a reasonable, rational, educated argument. But the physicists believe that philosophy is just nonsense. You don't have to study the whole history of philosophy to be able to make a reasonable judgment. So, yeah. But I don't blame the physicist. And the illustration that it takes is that in order to produce a shoe, if you're a craftsman making shoes, you have to have learned how to make a shoe. You have to have exerted your skill. It takes time, effort, patience, talent, maybe perseverance, will, the material, of course. You have to have the ingredients, so to speak, to create, to make, to produce a shoe. And Hegel says that because most people have feet and hands, they believe that unconsciously that they could themselves make shoes. But no, it takes effort and patience. And the same goes with philosophy, because everyone who is self-conscious can think. He thinks that he can criticize philosophy, but it's not as simple as that. Okay, now, 6th paragraph. Here's a very important idea. The content of philosophy is none other than the content produced by spirit, that which we call the world, the external world and the internal world. That's an idea that it took me quite a long time to understand. But philosophy, and especially Hegel's philosophy, talks about our world in the present, not 19th century Germany, also 19th century Germany, but it talks about our world, about the present, about today, about now, because our world is wirklich. So philosophy is the thought of Wirklichkeit. The inner world, inner thoughts, feelings, emotions, determinations, and the outer world, the world of time and space, and all the objects which are contained in this world. So this is the German word Wirklichkeit, and most people believe that philosophy is armchair theorizing. It's nonsense, it's babbling about some empty abstractions. Especially Hegel, and especially the Germans, and most of all, they believe that Hegel is the illustration of a completely abstract, nonsensical, speculative babbling. But Hegel says here, philosophy, the object of philosophy is Wirklichkeit, what is actual, what people call reality. Yeah, and says that the consciousness that we have of this content, which is being, the world, actuality, we call this experience, to have an experience of the world, and the scientists in our day and age call an experience a scientific experience of the world, an experiment. And then Hegel distinguishes Erscheinung, which is appearance or apparition, phenomena in a way, and Wirklichkeit, but then that's a very complex logical distinction, and logic only comes afterwards. So what appears and what is actual are two different modes of experiencing the content, so I will skip on that and develop later in the logic. Philosophy differs only according to the form, which is the form of pure thought, from any other way, any other manner of becoming conscious of this one and unique content, which is being. Wherever you go, there is being. Because you cannot go into nothing, because it means that nothing would be a place, so it would not be nothing, it would be a spatial determination. So wherever you go, there is being. So because of this, because philosophy is the knowledge of the world, being, Wirklichkeit, its adequation with experience is necessary. In German it's die Übereinstimmung mit der Wirklichkeit und Erfahrung. So basically idealism, and philosophy is idealist, and empiricism have to coincide. The idea of reality and the reality of reality have to become one eventually. And Hegel says that the final purpose of philosophy is the reconciliation of thinking reason, self-conscious reason, which is I identify with reason, namely I have the certainty of being the whole of reality. And the purpose of philosophy is to reconcile subjective reason with the reason which is, namely Wirklichkeit. My mind and the world have to become one eventually, and that's why I am studying philosophy. And then there is a very famous, often misquoted, misinterpreted sentence. I will read in German. Was vernünftig ist, das ist wirklich. Und was wirklich ist, das ist vernünftig. Which means what is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational. And there are at least three ways, 3 degrees of understanding this idea. The first, which is the basic, is that what is real, what is rational is real, what is real is rational. And here, reality means what people ordinarily believe to be reality, an external world. And rationality would mean scientific understanding, what Hegel would call der Verstand, nicht die Vernunft, der Verstand. And the physicist, the biologist, the chemist, and even some sociologists, economists, they believe that the world and the topic that they study is rational, that there are laws, regularities, structure in the object that they study. All physicists presuppose that the physical world is rational. Chemistry and biology, the laws are more complex. It's much more difficult to grasp in a determinate, fixed, precise, and accurate way the quantitative determinations of laws, but chemists and biologists believe that there is rationality in chemical and biological processes. An economist, he believes that the economic fluctuation, the creation and destruction of wealth, the good or bad use of investment, consumption, that it follows certain rules. Economists believe that human beings are rational agents. So they believe that rationality is real in the sense that in the realm of economics, if you are a rational agent, you will maximize utility, as they speak. And they also believe that what is real in the terms of the economics, economic growth, prosperity, crisis, the economic depression, that it is rational in a sense that there are reasons, there are causes. That's why economists spend their time explaining all the fluctuations of the economy. So this is the first level of understanding this often misquoted and misinterpreted sentence. Every scientist believes that the world is rational and the rational is real. But then there's the second level. Here, rational is not verständig, as in the first moment, but vernünftig, which means mystical in a way. And the second way of understanding this is that only what is mystical is really real, and we have a word in German for really real, which is wirklich, as differentiated from Realität or Existenz. Wirklichkeit is reality which contains the idea of itself within itself. So it's the manifestation of an idea. So the second way of understanding this sentence is that what is mystical is actual, what is actual is mystical. And the third degree would be to consider die Vernunft as the self-consciousness which knows itself to be the whole of reality. Namely, I know myself since August 2018 to be the whole of reality. So the way I interpret this is that reality but also Wirklichkeit are vernünftig. So they are the manifestation of my mind, basically. So these are the three levels of understanding this sentence. And just to illustrate the first moment, in December 2017, I understood. I was walking when I could walk. I could no longer walk. I was walking in the dark. It was very early in the morning, and I said to myself, I will make my walkabout, my wandering, and when I have finished my little wandering, my walk in the park, it was not a park, it was a field, but when I finished my walk in 45 minutes, I know that the sun will have risen in the sky. Although strictly speaking, the sun doesn't rise, it's the earth who moves, but in the ordinary expression, I know that the sun will rise because the determination of the solar system, the movement and rotation of the earth around the sun, which makes us believe that the sun rises and sets, are rational. There are laws governing the movement of the planets in the solar system. I knew this, but I became conscious of this basic, simple fact that every undergraduate or a junior high school or high school student should know. And I also realized that I was a thinking subject and that I could think about the solar system and that my thoughts would become manifest if I understood properly, namely that I understood that the sun would rise and eventually it arose because my thoughts were rational and the solar system was rational. So my thoughts became real and reality became rational. I mean, they had already always been, but the consciousness had just occurred. So, and when it happened, I had a profound mystical experience. So, yeah, that's my personal anecdote regarding this sentence. But yeah, and then the problem, because it's a very problematic sentence, because Hegel is, in the view of those who are vaguely familiar with Hegel, this crazy speculative metaphysician who says everything is rational. But then you have to justify history. I mean, history is rational. And then people say, maybe Hegel was a little bit out of his mind. Let us bring contingency, indeterminacy, atheism. Yeah, because we don't want to rationalize history. That's what people like Karl Popper and modern historians believe. Because otherwise you have to justify totalitarianism, and other stuff. So that's why Hegel, the historical Hegel, has been accused of being a totalitarian thinker, and even Plato, because Hegel and Plato, basically, they are idealist thinkers, and the modern view is that from Plato to the Gulag, or from Hegel to Nazi Germany, although he is not associated with Nazi Germany, but the idea is that if you start to think like a philosopher, you think like a totalitarian mind, and totalitarian thinking ends up in political totalitarianism. That's the view of skeptical, rationalistic, enlightenment thinkers like Popper and the school of epistemology following Karl Popper. Yeah. Okay. So then he distinguishes Dasein, Erscheinung, Existenz, Wirklichkeit. So Dasein is Dasein, it cannot be translated. Erscheinung would be appearance or phenomenon. Existenz would be existence. And Wirklichkeit would be actuality. And there's also Realität, which would be reality. So these are various modes of what we, in ordinary consciousness, call reality. But Hegel says there are various logical steps in the process of reality. Dasein is not Realität. Realität is not existence. It is not Erscheinung. It is not Wirklichkeit. They are different. Okay. And then he talks about contingency and possibility. So this is the introduction of the Encyclopedia. So Hegel will develop in the logical unfolding of the categories and the entire logical process, the distinctions, the conceptual distinctions between what is contingent, what is possible, what is necessary, what is wirklich, etc., etc. So that's just the introduction. But to illustrate, in our ordinary consciousness, we use the word possible, impossible, but we do not know what is possible and impossible. We predicate vague determinations. To win the lottery, is it possible or impossible? It is possible because there is the statistical possibility of winning the lottery, but actually it's impossible because the statistical possibility is so tiny that it's impossible, but actually it's possible because there's always a winner. So these are the kind of questions yeah. So if you want to know what is possible or impossible, read this, which I am providing an introduction to help myself and others who are reflections of myself. I have understood this by reading Hegel. To understand possibility, impossibility, contingence, necessity, etc., etc. And then Hegel says that if we oppose die Wirklichkeit des Vernünftigen, the actuality of the rational, in the sense of vernünftig, for Hegel, what is actual is rational. But he says that another view might be to think that the ideas, with a great I, ID, of philosophy are just abstract, disconnected theorizing, what the Anglo-Saxons call armchair thinking, which produces dreams and chimeras, namely fantastical, nonsensical creatures. But we will talk about fantastical creatures later. This is to illustrate in ordinary consciousness, people who are vaguely familiar with philosophy, the Anglo-Saxons. I keep talking about the Anglo-Saxons, but because in the realm of philosophy, they are opposed to the Germans, basically. They call this armchair theorizing. For a typical Anglo-Saxon mind, someone like Plato, the Neoplatonist, Plato talking about the idea of the good, the Neoplatonist talking about the one, the Germans, people like Leibniz, but even more people like Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. It's the embodiment of nonsensical armchair theorizing. The Anglo-Saxons believe that this, especially the German metaphysicians, are some sort of deluded, crazy, speculative, nonsensical idealists talking about nonsense. And Hegel believes that the Anglo-Saxons are like this, so they accuse one another. So yeah, but he says precisely that what der Verstand, which is ordinary rationality, scientific rationality as we understand this in the modern world, produces nothing but dreams. So the modern scientists believe that metaphysics, especially German metaphysics, produces nothing but dreams, and the German metaphysicians believe that der Verstand produces nothing but dreams. So, but German metaphysics can explain Anglo-Saxon thinking, to simplify, but Anglo-Saxon thinking cannot explain German metaphysics except by saying that it's armchair theorizing and nonsense. But German metaphysics has a conceptual, logical, metaphysical view of what der Verstand is and what atheistic, rationalistic, modern science is. Yeah. Then, Hegel talks about das Sollen, which could be translated as what should be, but more accurately, what ought to be. It ought to be this way. So it is not, but it ought to be. And that's here, honestly, it's very complicated because he mentions the idealist, not in the sense of philosophical idealist, but in the ordinary sense, people with high elevated ideas, especially in the realm of politics. Idealists like to talk, or not necessarily idealists, but politically minded people, not politicians, but politically minded people, people who have an interest in politics. They like to talk about how the world ought to be, how things should be, or how it ought to be. Economics, politics, we ought to have a more democratic society, less inequalities, or more freedom, less taxes, etc. It ought to be different. But that's a very profound, very difficult question to which I have no answer. And Hegel just introduces the idea that is the world how it is, or should the world be different? And I will illustrate by an example from modern America, the United States of America. There are many views. One could say that America ought to be a more egalitarian socialist country. That's the view of the left in America, that they think that America ought to be, should be, more egalitarian and should eventually become a socialist state. There are the conservatives who believe that America ought to be great again. So it should be great again, which in their view can vary, but basically it would be less taxes, more freedom. It depends, because there are various levels of conservatives in America, but they think that America ought to be made great again. Then there are those who believe that America ought to be, should be, multicultural, diverse, because it is, in the language of Hegel, the realization of the concept of the Constitution of the US. So these mostly leftist people who says that America ought to be a multicultural and diverse country because it is the development of the idea of the founding fathers, although some say America ought to be multicultural, but we should remove the founding fathers. But they do not understand that it was contained in the idea of the Constitution of the founding fathers that America ought to become multicultural, because they did not mention any racial determinations. They were empirically racist and slave owners, some of them, but from a conceptual level, they were beyond race. So there are many contradictions, but yeah. So there are people who say America ought to be a diverse multicultural country, but one could say America is precisely a diverse and multicultural country. So it is what it ought to be, according to these people. Then there are those who believe that America ought to be basically a neo-Nazi ethno-state, that America ought to be a white ethno-state, that it should belong to whites, because they believe whites settled there, built America, developed America, and made everything great about America. That's their view. So they should create a white ethno-state on the North American continent. These are the ideas of white nationalists. And finally, there are those who believe that America should become Mexico, because whatever, these are the Hispanics who believe that they should reclaim the parts of America because it belonged to Mexico. So there are these people too. And there are those who say America ought to belong to the native Indians and ought to have remained the land of the natives, and whites shouldn't have come there. So there are various degrees of ought to, sollen in German, of should. America should be like this, should be like that, etc. And every American believes that America should be different from what it is. But those who are right from a conceptual standpoint are those who say that America ought to be multicultural and diverse, because in the language of Hegel, this is the truth of the concept of the American Constitution. All men are created equal, freedom of opportunity, pursuit of happiness. So America has become, over the past 2 centuries and more, what its concept implied that it would become. That's what I could say. So one could say, what is America? America is the totality of all the determinations which say what America ought to be. And here we're entering the realm of Hegelian subtleties, because the is, how America is, contains within itself the ought to be. It ought to be what it is, and it is what it ought to be, what it should be. So here, really, that's really complicated, but that's just the introduction. But it's just to illustrate the question of what should be or ought to be and what is. That's a philosophical question. So yeah, and the entire life of political America, I will conclude with this, the entire life of America and American politics is determined by all the people who believe that America ought to be this way or that way, that it should be this or that. And America is the land of opportunities, the land of contradictions. That's why it's a Hegelian country. So yeah, that's what I could say about these 3 paragraphs.